Red Cave Podcast. Reading tonight from the Tales from the Crack series 1 through 3. The first story, The Thing on the Threshold, followed by A Conjuring for Lilith, and concluded with Between Wing and Water, a Bermuda Triangle mystery. Once it smiled a silent dell, where the people did not dwell. They had gone unto the wars, trusting to the mild-eyed stars, nightly from their azure towers, to keep watch above the flowers, in the midst of which all day the red sunlight lazily lay. Edgar Allan Poe. The Thing on the Threshold. When the confirming ding resounded between her ears, Matilda ruminated on the fact that it always drummed up the same feeling of dread within her. Why, she couldn't rightly say, but she likened it to the dread she felt on her own, knowing that she woke up every day with no prospects or new leads to carry her down the road toward career success and a family. The ding in her head was a reminder of that ticking clock in her life, that she was gifted with one more day to make a connection, but the system in the receiver in everyone else's skull would prevent her from ever progressing. Something was different about this day, Matilda could be sure. Looking around at the graveyard shift reception desk and computer monitor set up in front of her, with all of its security camera postage stamps, told her that it was just another night and another dollar. It was just her in the lobby, as with every night, and she could at least be thankful that it wasn't like her first nights on the job, when the elderly patients were up and about after hours and she was required to summon up enough authority to calm them, come down to their level, and then lead them back to bed. Once she proved to herself that she could do the hard parts of the job, the patients stopped leaving their beds at night. Or maybe they didn't trust her and were afraid of confronting her in the night. Either way, it made for a quiet graveyard shift, and she would need a little bit more excitement to stay awake, and Sudoku puzzles were not doing it for her. Ordinarily, she would just overload her guts with steaming coffee rather than logging on to the Connect 2 system. Like most teens growing up, she had tooled around with the skull-to-skull technology, but she only needed to navigate the downtown streets to know who most of the customers of this technology were. Anyone new to her city might look at the vast amount of vagabonds carrying out intelligent conversations with themselves and think the social fabric was unraveling. Although Matilda would agree with that testimony wholeheartedly, she knew that the vast majority of these homeless men and women were on board the Connect 2 system and were speaking with their remote pen pals, friends from other parts of the planet that the system had paired them with to share their head and thoughts for the rest of the day, or the rest of their lives if they were compatible enough. Connect 2 was released on the aftermath of depressive cases sweeping Matilda's city, and loneliness was the major culprit. Matilda's job prevented her from meeting people, at least anyone her age, so she was willing to kill the boredom any way she could, even if that meant she would be paired with one of these sorry souls living in the gutter outside her door. She often fired up the Connect 2 receiver in her skull by plugging the adapter into the permanent earpiece attached to the side of her skull, and everyone else she knew. She used the adapter and its separate controller to log onto the internet and select the Connect 2 server. Often she scrolled through the names and professions of all the current users, but could never pull the trigger, as she was looking for someone like her, she supposed, working some night shift and bored off her tits, looking for a new best friend. But, like usual, most of the users had men's names, and they hadn't bothered to list their professions, which told her they were most likely living in the tent cities just 20 minutes down the main street from her. She didn't really want to share her headspace with a man, as she had never done it before, and even though there were plenty of fail-safes to block any user and excommunicate yourself from the system with the touch of a button, she considered herself to be a sensitive, an empath, and her encounters with miserable and tortured people in person were enough to leave bad impressions and trauma on her, so she wondered what a tortured soul could do to her from within. She shuddered at the thought. But on this night she was willing to roll the dice. as there was a name she found listed with his current profession, and she was able to deduce right away that this man was at his job like her, and the night was still young. It wasn't the fact that he was a graveyard shifter like her that she finally selected his name and sent an invitation to connect. No, it was the profession he had listed under his name. He worked at the Akram Institute, which had gained a reputation in the city for operating in the Black Ops programs, working with military intelligence groups. No one really knew what the firm did, as they seemed to work with marketeers and psychologists to introduce the greatest new fad medicine. But it wouldn't seem that they were just a research lab for pills, as they also bought up land, engineered livestock, developed TV packages for news channels to feature their new product, participated in oil spill cleanups and humanitarian efforts, and even built rockets that they shot into space. Matilda wondered what they didn't do, but she also knew that anyone who worked for Akram signed an NDA. She'd heard that from a family member who used to work there, who likened it to a Freemason kind of brotherhood that he would never betray for threat of incarceration. Matilda had the sense that the repercussions were much worse than that, just judging by the twinge of pain that had been alive on her great-uncle's face when he spilled the beans to her. "Hello, is this Matilda?" a sunny and youthful male asked in her ears. Her shoulders immediately relaxed to know that this man was young. Hadn't her pre-teen friends and her first signed on to that program to meet boys? Isn't that why anyone would let someone into their own heads with them? "Yes, is this John? From Akram?" she replied out loud. Although Connect 2 could transfer silent thoughts between participants, it was safer to drown out the thoughts and feelings with actual words. She didn't want to give away how flushed she was at that moment, for instance, even though she wondered if it was apparent in her voice. "Ah, I see I got someone's attention with that," John replied with an audible chuckle. "You know, most people skip over my name when they see Akram listed. Everyone's interested in speculating about the rumors on the web, but the moment they get a chance to meet someone beyond the curtain, they shy away. The conspiracy has a much bigger weight than what I can ever shed light on." "So you're saying all the stories are bunk then? You aren't working with off-world entities?" "I can tell by your voice you're making a joke," John replied. "Would I be on this platform if my job was that exciting?" Matilda laughed. "I suppose not. You're working an 8-hour? "I'll be doing a double," John replied. "I'm on my last leg now." "Oh, wow. So are you safe to talk then?" John paused and they both heard static in their skulls. "I'd like to know what you do first, if I could. Tell me about your interesting job, Matilda. It can't be all that bad." "Oh, I like it just fine," she said. "I just man the reception desk while all our elderly residents are sleeping. I work at an old folks' home." "That must be very rewarding. I respect that very much, Matilda," John said. "I'm working a double right now, so I have enough to support my grandma at home." "That's wonderful to hear, John. My grandma is my favorite person in the world. What's her name?" "Maxine," John said with pride. "I'd love to give back to her and her friends with a job like yours. Give me the exciting details." Matilda laughed again. "Not a whole lot of excitement here tonight, or any night for that matter, John. The people who live here are the sweetest ever." "There has to be someone manning the reception desk for a reason," John proposed. "There must be something you provide that no one else can." "Well, if you want to go woo with me, I've been kept on my toes a few times," Matilda ventured with the same light-hearted tone. "Sometimes I'll see the front doors open themselves and catch a hint of someone passing around a corner. None of the residents ever seem to leave, even after they die. I kind of treat them as our secondary clientele. So I'll wave and greet them when the front doors open by themselves. I figure they're just coming in from a midnight walk, which they were never allowed to take when they lived here. I don't blame them at all. I'll even joke with them that their secret is safe with me." Matilda was met with a surge of fear and pain through her skull that she'd never experienced before, and it left her reeling, gripping the edge of her desk and watching the room spin as she hung on for dear life. As soon as it passed, she was struck with a mental image of an empty cell, cold, white, and luminescent. And she knew that this wasn't her experience, but John's. "John, is everything all right?" Matilda asked. "Yes," he said calmly. "I'm here. Did we disconnect for a minute?" I was just going to say how creepy all that sounds. Your job is more exciting than you give it credit for. I just saw something, Matilda said, shaking her head as if to dislodge the thought. It was a cell, but it was empty. Why is it so scary? If it wasn't for these devices we were born with, I would swear you were a mind reader, John said. I'm connected with all my emergency contacts, like I'm sure you are, and I've never had them pick up on visual thoughts from my head. With the kind of work I do, I would be in big trouble for even talking to you right now as I am. I guess I understand now. Sorry, I didn't mean to pry, Matilda said. My friends call me an empath because I can feel everything they do, even before they tell me what's happening in their lives. They don't like to share with me here and connect too for that reason. Well, that's a bit embarrassing then, John said. Here you are describing your encounter with the spirit world, and you have no fear at all. In fact, you're comforted because they're good ghosts. I didn't know good ghosts existed, but I would take a sweet old lady any day over. I'm sorry, we don't have to talk about it, Matilda cut in. She wasn't sure she wanted to explore that cell any further with John anyway. I have one job, Matilda, and that's to watch this cell at the end of the hall. The glass walls are polarized, so I'm not allowed to see inside most of the time. Sometimes I've peeked in through one of the chinks in the glass, but that cell's always been empty. You watch over an empty cell at night? They tell me it's not empty is the thing, John said, his voice hushed now. I feed whatever it is twice a night, but the meat I feed it is incinerated to ash. When I drop it into the cell, it's always gone the next day. Of course, they won't tell me what it's all about, so I can only speculate. What kind of animal would eat meat turned to ash? Matilda asked. Animal? I'm not so sure about any of that, John answered cautiously. The qualifications for the job were extensive, mostly the health check. I had to be at exceptional health. They won't hire anyone over the age of 40 to work on the floor, and I can only think it has something to do with the meat. The steaks I'm provided here are raw, and even in the fridge, they rot faster than normal. Anything that's already dead rots much faster here. I killed a fly once and watched it shrivel and flake away to nothing, right in front of my eyes. What could it be? Some experiment? I don't ask questions like that. Not around here, Matilda, John said. But I don't think it's alive. At least in the sense that we're alive. How can that be? Says the girl who just told me doors open on their own in her place of work, John shot back, and he wasn't laughing this time. It's the same reason you know your midnight visitors are friendly ghosts. I look at that cell and at the gray hairs on my head, and I don't think it's anything good. As soon as he finished saying that, Matilda yelled out when the automatic doors slid open in front of her desk, stalling there a moment for the unseen visitor to step beyond the sensor, and then pushing closed again. Something wrong? John asked. Matilda stared at the welcome mat, unsure whether she should laugh or spring away from her desk and through the same automatic doors. Don't tell me you just saw something, John cried excitedly. The doors just opened, Matilda heaved. Usually it doesn't surprise me that much, but the fact that we were just talking about it concerns me a bit. It's like they're listening. I guess that's my fault then, John began. Maybe I should... He was cut off by a bang that set off a series of curses on the other end and loud footfalls down the hall. Then silence. John, talk to me. What happened? He was breathing loudly now, and those waves of fear were fresh, weighing down Matilda's head like torrents of water. Yes, Matilda, I just got startled is all, John said at the tails of a deep breath. One of the office doors just banged open here. I've never seen that in my life. And whatever just walked in, I felt a cold wind go past my desk, going down the hall, and I had to run the other way. Down the hall, you think? I wish I had your same conviction, John said. You can watch a door open and know it's one of your residents, but here, how can I trust anything I can't see? Matilda found that she was still staring doubtfully at the welcome mat in front of the front doors, somehow aware that she was still being watched, and it didn't feel friendly, not this time. I don't know if I could ever be sure, Matilda breathed. I just assumed, but... Oh God, John cried. The polarized glass, it's gone, I can see inside. What? What's happening? Matilda was standing upright now. Hold on, more scuffling feet. Good Lord, it's freezing, Matilda. Does it get cold like this for you? Before Matilda could respond, she heard a loud click, and there was no ignoring the sound of a large and sticky door swinging open. John screamed then, and the sound of the opening door receded as he no doubt sprinted to the other end of the hall, his footsteps thundering against the wall. Matilda felt sick to her stomach, and she doubled over, smelling the rotten meat in her nostrils and listening to the man's loud wheezing in her ears. "Your ghost!" John screamed. "It opens doors, not just the lobby ones." "What? My ghost? What do you—" "It's open!" he yelled, still running, still hyperventilating. Then the loud alarms cut off the rest of the background noise, and when Matilda closed her eyes, she could see the red lights flashing from the bulbs in the ceilings. "An old lady?" John shrieked. "She's laughing at me! Jesus, she's in here with us! Don't you hear her laughing? Grandma Max, she's screaming! Don't touch her!" A loud door slammed on the other end, muffling the sirens, and the sound of echoing footsteps told Matilda that he was running down a stairwell now. And what replaced the alarm sounds were clearly the wicked laughter of a woman, somewhere riddled in the static of the Connect 2 device, and the far-off screams of countless elderly men and women. And was that her own grandma she was hearing now? She heard an actual moan down the hall from her, from one of the closed rooms, and she rounded around the desk to poke her head down the dimly lit passageway. As soon as the moan came again, but from a different source across the hall, Matilda heard John squeak to a halt on his rubber soles, screaming at the top of his lungs as something loud cracked and something else spilled across the floor. Before the connection between both of their skulls was severed with the same audible ding that connected them, Matilda saw an image of the olive-eyed beast, no longer invisible and very solid. It was there on the final step of the stairwell, albino-skinned, hairless, and hunched forward on long appendages that ended in blade-like claws. Its pumpkin-shaped head reared up in her mind's eye, seeming to recognize that there were two of them sharing that head. And when its claw shot forward to extract John from his own skull, they went scratching around in there for her, but she had already evacuated, ripping the earpiece from the side of her head in a torrent of warm blood. Bursting into the nearest room, the moaning had changed to blood-curdling screeches, and before Matilda could press the emergency button on the wall and call in backup, the old man in the bed had already noticed her and pointed a gnarled finger at the farthest ceiling corner. She could see the albino thing dancing in the man's wavering, bulging eyes, so she didn't have to look up to know that they were no longer alone. It was ready to feed, but perhaps not on her bones. She could only hope there in her last moments. It fed on things that were already dead or near death. Then she looked down at her shirt front, at the bright red stain spreading there from the wound in her ear, and she knew she was already there. She breathed to herself in the end and looked up at the olive eyes and open oval of a mouth, sucking up the dead air, dust, and skin like a vacuum, and knew that she had brought it there, and it told her in her mind that it would feed on her last, even as its claws still dripped with John's crimson lifeblood, smearing against the ceiling plaster as it readjusted itself for purchase on its perch. Matilda thought she could hear the screams in her head. There was only one way to sever that connection, the thing told her, and she begged for it, dropping to her knees. But she knew she'd have to hear it for a little while longer, the pleas and cries of the gentle soul she'd cared for over her last year on the job, and she'd have to hear the last gasping cry of each one before the sun could return. She pictured the cell in her mind's eye, attempting to push the creature inside, but all she managed to do was shut the white glowing door on herself. At least the screaming had stopped. At least she was no longer bleeding. And she wouldn't have to inspect her own blood-streaked arms and legs, as they were now invisible. She settled down on the floor in a ball, staring up at the burning white light above her head, and she wondered when dinner time was. A Conjuring for Lilith. Was I a bad neighbor? Seeing that I was the corner apartment, I beg your understanding, I never much thought about the people on either side of me, as I only shared my north wall with any living, breathing souls, and I knew from experience that she was hard of hearing and was known to play her home theater system as loud as she could humanly tolerate. Thus, I never thought it necessary to resist turning up my music to the max, and for good reason indeed, I assure you. Like many of the other hapless radio heads filling their silence with the same four chords on repeat, I bump my freestanding speakers liberally for all to hear, but for the purpose of research. The frequencies and vibrations that press against my four walls, ceilings, and floor are those of a particular order and substance that any layman would find difficult to comprehend as melody or even translate into anything but barnyard raucousness. Surely you must have guessed by now that it isn't music in any real sense of the word, but an eminence that serves a concerted purpose into otherworldly affairs only those schooled in the occult will nod their heads at in knowing recognition. It resembled something like a mix between a didgeridoo crackling in a fire, layered with the death rattle of a smoker's gasp on their last night on earth, fighting for their life. All the while, as ear-prickling drums and displaced violins crescendo to a sudden full clatter of domino percussion instruments falling in on each other. If it isn't music, then why play it? Well, it was once music, but the man who sold me this particular record in his oddity shop had recorded it himself from a master tape of a Gregorian chant of the Baroque period. But there shouldn't be anything special about this religious organ music, I hear you say. No, you would be incorrect again, as it was carefully recorded backwards in the same spirit of the rock and roll backmasking of the 1960s, but at 6.6 the speed. I can hear the gears turning in your head now, and I suppose for good reason, but you would have to understand that the record was sold as part of a set. The occult journal accompanying the piece of wax and plastic provides a step-by-step account on the most fundamental method for accomplishing a conjuring. A conjuring of what evil? Would it even be worth my time or yours to insist that it is nothing satanic or demonic? Then I will save my breath and explain that the occult journal is nothing short of a love letter to Lilith, the supreme goddess of creation formed on the same day as Adam and Eve, the wondrous temptress and true wife of the serpent, the mother of the beast and all his brethren. The unnamed man who wrote the journal and provided instructions on recording and playing the record was a true explorer into the other recesses of this world and the next. The keeper of the oddity shop never did express to me the current well-being of such a man of spiritual science, but I feel there would be no need to follow through with such a fact-finding pursuit. No, the journal and record are mine. That is all that matters now. And the shopkeeper only recorded the vinyl so as to complete the set and sweeten the deal. No one but me has the wherewithal to devote himself to an unknown future such as that possessed by your poor, tortured writer, and that is all well and good. Lilith chooses her mates carefully, and I am the one with the strength and will to answer such a call, and she called me by my name. But what completes the set? While the music plays, the listener performs painstakingly the ritual of building his idol, his doll, if you will. The material for the doll must be taken from the earth, but from what material, it doesn't truly matter. The only thing that counts is that the listener builds up the effigy, performs the alchemical marriage with the doll through oil, alcohol, and salt, and then tears it down again. My dolls are strictly fashioned from straw, as I have some experience with basket weaving from my summer camp days in the northeast of America. Every night I build up my Lilith doll, adorn her with 3 parts oil, salt, and alcohol as a gift, and then disassemble her again, all in the divine rite of passage as she passes from the void into this crystallized realm, and then back into her realm of chaos. During those few moments in which we share the same space, she is real, here in my hands, and we are husband and wife. The shopkeeper told me of instances where molds of clay and stone came alive for the sculptors, earth made into flesh, and Lilith was never wont to leave her lover's arms again. In fact, she was known to take them back with her, by the hand, into her realm. Those are his words, of course, and I was 3 months into my endeavor before I was deviating from the instructions in the leather-bound journal, sometimes keeping my effigy for days, dining and sleeping with it, before dismantling it again to begin all over. All with 0 success, mind you. It was perhaps to my utmost relief that I stopped playing the record altogether at the request of my landlord, living directly below me, who could no longer stand the haunting, strange overtones reverberating against his ceiling. There were no complaints from the woman living directly above me, however, but the landlord insisted, with much consternation, that she was away for business until the end of the month. Thus, I gratefully acquiesced to his request to stop playing my experimental music, as he was known to call it, and promised that I would find a new place to practice my ritual, though he never knew the full truth of the matter or asked for elaboration. And that was originally my plan, I assure you, as I had hoped that a change of scenery would bring me closer to my love. The journal, in fact, recommended setting a secluded part of the forest as the stage for my shrine to Lilith, and I set my sights on an abandoned encampment I knew just outside of town, where I hoped to continue my practice uninterrupted and far from prying eyes and ears. An apartment was no place for me to dedicate my heart, body, and soul to the fairest Lilith. So I sleeved my unlabeled vinyl and packed up my crafting materials for a weekend trip as soon as my day job would allow. So, the short story long is that, after some 12 weeks of persistent music and craft work indulgences after work from my bar job, I didn't experience a single out-of-sort event, that is, until I was sitting silent and bored in my apartment, all of my senses open and occult paraphernalia pushed away out of sight under my bed. The first sign of strangeness came with a pronounced creak on the floorboards above my head, sometimes deciphered as a peripheral noise, while striding through my own creaky hallway on my way from the bedroom to the bathroom. How could her floor have the same shoddy boards in the same exact spot in the hall? I tell you this because it only took about my 7th trip through the hall that I was sure the groaning was not coming from the boards below me, but from those above. Whenever I stopped, so did the noise. It was only while exercising my own heel and toe in a full-bodied step that I heard it, as if my own weight was causing the walls and ceiling to bend in response. That had been my first thought, but it didn't seem likely, and I was reminded the next day from my landlord that my upstairs neighbor was indeed still out of town. I had never paid too much attention to what her footsteps sounded like above my head, as our schedules never matched up too closely, and I arrived home from work far after she had already gone to bed. Somehow, my instinct told me that what I was hearing was not the result of my own footfalls. No, they became more pronounced the longer I went without the music, and they followed my same path, my usual course through my apartment, from the kitchen to the living room, from the bedroom to the front door. And would you believe me if I told you that I heard the door to my neighbor's house open at the same time as mine? I am shaking now recalling it, but would you also believe that I heard steps in the same stairwell directly above me whenever I proceeded to the first floor? And yes, I know what you're thinking. I always waited outside my apartment building to see if anyone would follow me out, but after 10 minutes, no one ever showed. Whenever I sat down in my worn leather sofa, I heard the same creaks and bends of the wooden frame, and I heard similar chair legs scrape against the hardwood floor in my upstairs neighbor's apartment whenever I pulled my own away from the kitchen table. There was nothing to convince me that my neighbor had placed comparable furniture in the same corners of her rooms, with the same faulty springs, and had taken up my exact routine, standing and sitting, showering and flushing the toilet in unison with me. In fact, I had no reason to doubt my landlord's words, as he told me that she had paid in advance for the month, and that he had even agreed to check in on her apartment a few times while she was away. As soon as I heard that, I begged him to let me accompany him on his first visit to her domicile, just for my peace of mind, and with much conviction and incessant reminders on our run-ins in the laundry room, he finally allowed me to shadow him on his check-in, and I was not surprised to see that her furniture was much different than my own. She didn't own wooden kitchen chairs or springy sofas like mine. She had rattan chairs and a solid block of a futon on opposite ends of the room. In fact, her entire apartment was an opposite image of mine, with the kitchen and living room reversed, and my landlord was quick to say he told me so. But as we stepped out of her apartment, I heard the same creaks above my head again, in the apartment above hers, and my landlord did not seem fazed in the slightest, as that neighbor was most certainly home. But why would that neighbor's door open and close at the same time as ours? I became so obsessed that I devised a plan to spot the mystery walker with my own eyes and solidify my madness, and I knew that the outside terrace was my answer. I had avoided it up until that point, most afraid of watching the wooden boards on the terrace above me bend and groan, but I didn't look up to see it, at least not at first. I certainly heard it, the pressure of the unseen feet pressing and releasing along with the rhythm I set in motion as I dipped my own toes outside my sliding glass door. It was copying me, whatever it was, perfectly, step by step, just as I had always sensed it. I wondered if living in such close quarters with someone could do that to two people. Somehow synchronize our natural body rhythms, sync our unconscious minds so that we both felt the itching impulse to fetch that glass of water from across the room, or wake up at the same late hour of the night to relieve our bowels. But as I stood on my back porch, I knew this was not the case at all, as whoever it was, Lilith or my neighbor's unnamed house-sitter, it knew I was down there, and it was mirroring me perfectly, and worst of all, it knew I knew it was there. When I finally did crane my neck, standing stock still in the pounding of my own throat-clogged heartbeat, I saw the shadow of this person through the slats in the boards, as still as me, and when I dared to shift my weight forward against the handrail, I saw the shadow move in tandem. I almost screamed, and a terrifying thought of this thing screaming with me prevented me from ever opening my mouth. My intention had been to lean over the railing and look up, but I couldn't bring myself to place my hands on the guardrail. I didn't want to see her gnarled fingers, even though I had only a week ago dreamt of those fingers running through my hair in the heated passion of love. In my mind's eye, those were no longer my lover's well-manicured nails, but the twisted claws of a hag, plum-colored flesh slipping off like latex gloves, and nails lifting up at the cuticles when pressed against the cold steel. No, reader, I did not follow through with my plan, but I did squint my eyes and peek across the street at the apartment building exactly opposite, where I could see my own reflection in one of the far-off windows. Then I shifted my eyes upward, just a click, to catch a glimpse at what might be standing directly above my head, and I only caught a glimpse, just enough to blur my eyesight and spin my head. I tried to look again, but the reflection was gone, and I only stared at an empty terrace. And was my own terrace now empty too? I tore back inside my apartment and sprinted across the hardwood into my bedroom, listening to the same furious pounding on the ceiling above me, which finally caused my clogged screams to unleash. I scratched with my belongings under my bed, and I ended up searching the rest of the night for my wicker doll, which seemed to have walked out my door. Even the record was gone. Against my better judgment, I racked my brain to reconjure the image in my memory, even as my brain was dedicated to scrubbing it clean forever, for my own good. But I did not relent, and there on my bedroom floor I was able to piece it all together, like a dream I had been struggling to recall for the greater part of the day. And what I had seen on the third-floor balcony did not have any place in my world, or any others as far as I was concerned. She hadn't looked like my wicker look-alike, but something hybridized, like a scarecrow or a mannequin, that was unraveling around the roughest of her edges, bits of straw poking out of her shoulders and waist, or like pieces of jagged bone, now that I think of it. But there was noticeable shape to her hips and bosom that my doll had not possessed, which gave her more pronounced animation. As difficult as it is to explain, this was not a doll, but something with substance and dark as pitch, and her hair, God, it was like a bird's nest or trembling beehive, and her whole person had pulsated, flickering like a flame before it was gone. And just before the sun had begun to set, the music started to play in the apartment above me, muffled somewhere, far underwater, but somehow right there in the room with me, so loud that I couldn't drown it out with the most obnoxious commercials or the fullest dishwasher full of clanking wine glasses. It was so unbearable that I tore out of my apartment and piled into the elevator, too afraid to hear the same manic footsteps coming down the stairwell after me, as I was sure they would catch up with me this time. The elevator took me safely to the roof, and I crossed the black tar deck in the dying light just in time to catch the sunset, and I finally regained my breath for the first time in weeks, looking out across my city. I, of course, made sure that the emergency exit door was not about to swing open behind me, and it never did, thankfully, though I didn't think I'd ever be able to leave that roof or enter my apartment again. And, well, I never did enter it again, reader. I got off the roof. But it wasn't down those stairs, and it wasn't over the side of the building, or else I wouldn't be here to recount these words to you, jotted down in the back of that cursed journal I intend to lose as quickly as I can. You know, the thought never occurred to me there, at the end of this sordid tale. My nostrils flared, to at least fill my head with that sweet air, free from hellish choruses or creaking boards. It should have been in the back of my paranoid mind, which had long been ravaged by the belief that the Devil's Bride herself of Gnostic legend was sharing the same apartment building, the same bedroom, with me and me alone. But I was not expecting the drop of water as it spotted my forearm, and then my scalp, and looking down at the raising goose flesh on my arm, somehow I knew it wasn't rain at all but oil. I could even smell the alcohol in the air. And yes, I did look up, out of pure instinct, mind you, and locked eyes with the Lady Lilith that night. I was meant to receive uninterrupted her psychotic smile, full of elongated, spotless, inhuman teeth. I was destined to experience that electric shock through my innermost core as her orange eyes wavered and focused to zero in on me. They blazed like stars, and her fire caught in my own skull until my eyes overflowed with tears and I was forced to blink or else blind myself in that horrid sunspot. And her swan-like neck twisted just enough for her to stare down between her gray-toned, calloused toes at me, floating perhaps 2-3 feet above the tip of my nose. Her naked breasts, marked with raised turquoise veins, swelled with a shredding breath, and her red lips thinned as they pulled tighter into a smile too bright for her mouth. Still, her youthful beauty was appalling, her symmetrical cheekbones raised with a blush and the hint of a dimple and a wrinkle above the straight bridge of her nose. And the alcohol and oil poured off her in torrents, dripping off her reaching talons and the split ends of her twisted braids, which pulled her hairline tight halfway down the backside of her skull. "Lover," she cooed, directly in the cup of my ear, with a voice like gravel and rose petals crunching underfoot. But I was already scrambling for the fire escape, and I tumbled down all 5 flights. I couldn't have struck the pavement at the bottom any faster, or with any more sweet, unconscious relief, as I at least knew I wouldn't have to sleep in my bed that night, or any night for that matter. I gave everything I owned to Lilith that day, and it was adequately understood that my apartment and everything in it, record and doll included, were now hers, in exchange for the leather journal, of course, which contained all instruction on how to conjure, but not to banish. I found it at my hospital bedside when I woke up for the first time with 50 stitches in my temple and my right eye swollen shut. A parting gift from my almost lover, I'm sure, as I would never see her again, at least not in my waking hours. But I don't mind those dreams as much, as I am always so relieved to be alive when I wake from them. What that means for the longer sleep at the end of this life, I don't want to think about right now, though I'm sure our marriage bed will be as cold and stiff as I always remember it. And no, I never lived in a downstairs apartment ever again, only in a single-floor mobile home with heavy insulation on the exterior roof that would dampen even the loudest squirrel scratches or wet slaps of bare, naked feet. Between Wing and Water. This is Lieutenant Charles Carroll Tyler, Flight 19 reaching FT-74. I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn. This is FT-74. Please identify your coordinates so someone can help you, the radio sang back. After a long moment of static, the controller tried again. FT-28, this is FT-74. What is your trouble? I triggered the switch and sucked in air, not knowing how to continue. I looked down at my controls and decided that I would start there. Both of my compasses are out, and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I craned my neck to peek out the smoky glass. The outside was just as smoky, since there was a determined shroud of fog following me. I did catch fragmented hints of civilization below me, coming in and out like jigsaw pieces. I am over land, but it is broken, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale. I did seem sure of myself over the radio, but in reality I was not positive about my location over the Florida Keys. It would make sense, since I had been headed west. Yet that was when my compass had been fully functional. I tapped the plastic cover and watched as the needle whirred crazily, stalling and then speeding up again. I wondered where I had gone wrong. I was entirely familiar with the Avenger torpedo aircraft. I'd had more than the necessary flying hours to call myself an experienced pilot. It was a simple mission, to say the least. I was to instruct a total of 4 students in a simulated course from Fort Lauderdale east to a small strip of islands called Hen and Chicken Shoals, then south to the Bahamas, and then west back to the Florida coast, in a perfect triangle demonstration. I was only there as an instructor to watch over my trainees and make sure they weren't falling behind. Their main lesson was to learn the art of dead reckoning, which involved picking out their exact location based on their last recorded time interval. So, if they had left the Keys at 13:30 exactly, they should have known that another 20 minutes would bring them 67 miles due east. Everything had gone as planned until the return trip, where a strange mist, spreading as far up and down as I could see, fell upon us and forced us farther and farther apart. I began to lose radio communication between the students that were supposed to be at my nose and tail. The only ones I could still speak with were on my left and right wings, and they were experiencing the same sort of phenomena. Their radios were going in and out, and their compasses were faltering, and not just the heading indicator, which was the common electric compass. The magnetic compasses, completely free of any power sources, were unreliable as well. "Put the sun on your port wing and fly north up the coast," the radio explained. "Did you hear that? Ron? Carl? Anyone?" I was addressing my last string of trainees, hoping to God that I wasn't alone in this. "Roger, Lieutenant. The sun at port wing, and then north." That was Ron, on my left side. "Carl, do you copy?" Only dead air. I cursed under my breath and squirmed inside my seat. "Well, if anyone can hear me but cannot transmit back, find the sun and line it up with your left wing. Fly straight." The sun was just about the only certainty inside that silver sheen. I quickly made my maneuver and prayed that my students were all in concert alongside me. A few minutes later, rough turbulence rocked my plane and more of my instruments admitted to failure. My altimeter was next to go, which was there to show me my altitude above sea level. And then my airspeed indicator malfunctioned and presented me a nonsense code of zeros and ones. Now, no way of telling how fast I was flying through the air, which would be quite important in landing the plane. I tried my best to broadcast this information to the Fort Lauderdale Naval Base, but the responses kept coming back in unrecognizable jumbles. I looked back out and could see absolutely nothing to familiarize myself with. There was no land or sea. The world as I knew it was one complete whiteout. I could still see the sun's pinpoint of light behind my left wing, and I checked my watch. We should have been at the coast by now, and 17 minutes had passed since my last radio transmission with my pupil. Then Ron's voice came through, clear and precise. "Damn it, if we could just fly west, we could get home. Head west, for God's sakes." "Negative. I am heading this show. Do not redirect west. We are under strict instruction from the base." "The base? Have you? From the... recently? They're not listening." "You're not listening, FT-32. Be anything. Don't you see this isn't..." "Repeat that, FT-32. Ron, do you copy?" And that was the last I ever heard from him. Close to 17:30, rain speckled my windshield, and off-coast winds sent my wings off balance. It took more than my remaining strength to keep them aligned with my altitude indicator, which served as my virtual horizon, giving me a good idea of how parallel I was with the Earth. This was my last instrument properly functioning inside my cockpit, save for my fuel gauge. I was running on empty. There was maybe an hour left of flight time, and I needed to act fast. We had started the flight exercise a little after 13:40 that afternoon, and we were now 2 hours over schedule. I finally decided to take Ron's suggestion into practice. I thumbed the radio and tried to pronounce my words confidently and without strain. "We'll fly 270 degrees west until landfall or running out of gas. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When you reach less than 10 gallons, start to descend." I had completely lost track of the sun. The silver mist had taken on a grayish hue, dark and unyielding. The rain had let up, but not the wind. With each turbulent rip, I would yelp helplessly into my mask, straining my every muscle in my arms and legs to keep the control wheel steady. I was up and out of my seat, my seatbelts forgotten, throwing all my weight back and away from the controls, praying desperately under my breath. Ahead of me, the clouds were taking on a new shape. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but a good-sized bowl was beginning to form, collapsing in on itself like a narrow funnel. The funnel evolved into a tunnel, braided with tongues of slick electric bolts, reaching unseen into the darkest of pits. I was headed straight into it, and I could do nothing. I was too busy trying to keep my nose level. I couldn't even begin to turn left or right, not when I didn't know where the sky ended and where the sea began. As I entered the churning tunnel, I lost all control of my muscles. I plopped back into my seat and my arms were dormant at my sides. My chin dropped to my chest and my eyes clouded. All I could do was watch as some invisible force supported my wings and carried me safely through the bright lightning flashes. I must have lost consciousness, because when I shook myself awake, I was being spit out of the tunnel, and my hands were able to grasp the wheel once again. The mist had dispersed. I could clearly see the ocean below me, and an incoming stretch of land, emerging out of the sea like a jagged hulk of rock. The sun was positioned directly in front of me, which was strange because it had just been at my back, and it should have been ready to set close to the horizon. What was even stranger was that the sun was burning red. I checked my watch and saw that it was 1 p.m. My instruments were all working normally, except for the compass, whose needle sat perfectly steady, only it was pointing south. I switched on the radio and a voice burst through. Tuesday, December 8th, 1945. KPPL radio. Still no news on the lost Flight 19 that went missing from Fort Lauderdale Naval Base on December 5th of last week. They are thought to have vanished without a trace in a strange coastal mist somewhere in the Atlantic. Of the 5 planes that left that afternoon, none have been found. If you get a chance to pick up the most recent issue of Argosy magazine, you'll find a story on Flight 19. The title of the article is The Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Gateway, and I'm sure it'll bring a chill down your spine. Then the broadcast faded out into static. I landed my bomber on a stretch of desert land, too arid and bare to belong to the Keys, or any of the islands for that matter. There was no civilization anywhere to be seen, no buildings, vehicles, or radio towers of any kind. It was only vast desert as far as the eye could see. I stripped off my mask, forgetting the radio completely. I was too afraid of hearing more shaking newscasts, preaching to the masses of my very disappearance some 3 days ago. I fell out of my fuselage in a state of disorientation, crawling hand over knee across wasted sand, toward the sea, back toward the sea. Tune in next time at Red Cave Podcast. Reading from the Tales from the Crack series 4 through 6. Beginning with, every time a fictional character dies, a reptilian is born. Followed by Ghost Me, a backroom story. And concluded with Under Construction. Until then, guard your soul.